Well, hey there, HVAC pros and enthusiasts. Are you ready to take your skills to the next level? The HVACR Learning Network has just launched an exciting new e-learning course, High Performance Heat Pumps. And guess what? We're giving you free access to the first 2 chapters. Whether you're in the field, training for that next step, or simply want to sharpen your expertise, this course is packed with everything you need to understand and master high-performance heat pump systems, especially inverter-driven cold climate heat pumps. And the best part? You can access it anytime, anywhere, right from your favorite mobile device. It's HVACR learning made flexible and convenient for you. So what are you waiting for? Click the link. Dive into the HVACR Learning Network and start your free trial today. Your journey to HVACR mastery begins here. Well, hello everyone. Thank you for joining us once again on Did You Know, the ESCO HVAC show. So we have spent some time talking about refrigerant management and the responsibility that we are all going to have going forward when it comes to managing refrigerants, particularly those in the HFC spectrum, right? We're going through a very significant phase down of refrigerants. And so we're all going to see some changes as we move forward, especially these transitions through the AIM Act as well as through our international treaties for reduction of greenhouse gases. So we're joined today by David Reitz. David's been with us before from Matelex. How are you doing, sir? David, are your audio coming through?
Oh, just came through.
Ah, there we go.
Good to be back, Clifton.
Yeah, it's been a while. I was just looking. I think it was like April or so of 24 that we dove into a little deeper dive into what was happening with refrigerant management and understanding our roles and responsibilities and tools that we had for that. And we're also joined today by Tristam Coffin, president of Effecterra. How's it going, Tristam?
Doing well. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So this is your first time on the show. You know, we tend to have a lot of fun here. We bring hot topics from the industry to all of our viewers, and everyone that's joining us, please let us know where you're joining in from if you have any questions along the way, because this is going to be a even deeper dive than David and I had done before, right? So when we start looking at what's happening in the industry, whether you are in the residential, commercial, or industrial sector, you are going to be witnessing some changes in our industry, not just in equipment or the new refrigerants coming out. It's the ways that we manage existing refrigerants. You know, we still have a lot of refrigerant that are in systems right now. And the beauty about refrigerants that are already in service is those are not in direct relationship with the phase down, right? When we look at the phase down, that is the production of new refrigerants based on GWPs. And so when we look at refrigerants that's already in the market, that is already refrigerants we have the opportunity to better conserve and to be able to get them back into service when we do refrigerant retrofits, or we're doing system change outs where we're doing refrigerant modifications. So we have a lot of refrigerants that we have the potential of preserving so that we have service gas. A lot of people don't think about the whole aspect of service gas, but as we hit this phase down, remember, we're already 40% in. And in just a few years, we're going to be at an additional 30%. And our refrigerants at that point are going to be struggling to be used as service gases, right? Our new stock. So we have to manage what we currently have. So Tom, I appreciate you joining us. I seen you're out there early. Murph joined us from Jersey Shore. Paul Leonardi over in South Jersey as well. Thanks, guys. And if you have any questions along the way, let us know in the chat and we'll try to help address it, because this is something that not everyone is up to speed with. I think because it's changing so fast. Wouldn't you guys agree?
Absolutely. Feels like it's changing by the minute.
It really does. So let's go ahead and get started. I'll hand it over and I'll try to moderate in between and ask questions for our audience, and then see if there's some things. I'm sure there'll be things that I'll have questions on along the way. And as we get into this too, tell us about some of your background too and why you are where you are now in the industry. I always love to point out people that HVAC and refrigeration is so vast. It's like this giant tree that has limbs and branches and leaves everywhere. And there's so many different avenues that you go. And many of us don't even have an idea that we're going to be going the direction that we end up. And so I always love sharing those stories. All right, who's going to roll her off with? Who's going to start slides out for us today? Let me bring those in.
Slides are up, ready to roll when you are.
There we go.
Awesome. Well, do you want to take the intro slide here, or do you want me to dive in? And then I know we can introduce ourselves briefly, or you can do it for us as well. Happy to go either direction.
Sure. Well, let's go ahead and take it off if you want to, Tristam, and we'll bounce back and forth here.
Fantastic. Awesome. Well, thanks for the brief introduction, and great to be here again, as I said. And David and I are going to chat a little bit about automatic leak detection's role in climate-conscious refrigeration and why leaning into technologies like these are so critical. But kicking things off really with why refrigerants are important conversation, why refrigerant management is critically important in the first place, not just from a climate perspective, but also a dollars and cents perspective, and to what you were just outlining, Clifton, the importance around managing these refrigerants for the purposes of servicing. So the list is long. We'll try to touch on some of the high points. I'm looking forward to diving in here with you all. David, you want to introduce yourself, and then I can briefly introduce myself, and we can dive into the content here.
Sure. David Reitz. I'm U.S. Partnerships for Matelex, which is a division of the DeHaan Group, which has been working with refrigerants for 150 years.
Wow.
And really, Tristan and I have known each other for a long time, and we had a very engaging conversation just about a month ago or so. And so just really want to share that with the audience.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Fantastic. Thank you, David. Great to be here with you. My name is Tristam Coffin. As I said before, I'm one of the presidents here at Effecterra. We are a public benefit corporation providing sustainability technical support to companies, investors, government entities, and their partners. In short, one of our core competencies and main focus areas is on advanced refrigeration, AC and heat pump technologies, or more broadly, refrigerants. So easier way of putting it, we are equal parts a technology development group and consulting group that works on all things climate, I guess, if you may. So we will dive into the subject at hand here.
Yeah. One important part that I wanted to mention in there, some of our audience are very familiar with NASRC, and I think it's important that people recognize that you're a co-founder of that. So we're actually still having conversations and we're building out a CO2 training curriculum within NASRC. It's a very important part of our industry, and a lot of our educators are starting to look for those style of resources. That's really why we're here, is to make sure that everyone knows what's happening and have the resources to have successful programs and to be successful contractors.
Yeah, thank you for noting that. Yeah, the NASRC around for about a decade now. I had the fortunate opportunity to help co-found that about a decade ago. And yeah, they're doing quite a bit of work in the workforce development space, and the curriculum that you all are working on together is really what's going to move the industry. And I'll just throw a tag in there for the Refrigerant Emissions Elimination Forum to REEF, which is kind of the sister org that is very much in its infancy, but is growing to really support the HVAC sector, in addition to what NASRC is working on in the commercial refrigeration space. So
very cool.
More to come in that world as well. So
yeah.
What are we all doing here? What are we talking about?
Right.
This is the question. Refrigerant what?
Refrigerant what?
Refrigerant what? Exactly. So, many of you are often, or I would say very familiar with refrigerants, given you work quite closely in this space. But, when talking to broader audiences, the majority of the population has no idea what we're talking about when it comes to refrigerants and why it's important that we manage them. So even your customers, for example, probably don't take to account the importance of managing refrigerants from both a cost, compliance, and climate perspective. And that's what we're going to be chatting more about today.
Excellent.
So put in the context, when you hear about climate and some of the treaties and negotiations that Clifton was referring to, really there's three categories of emissions when referred to, and that's scope 1, 2, and 3. Some would say as easy as ABC. I'm not quite sure that that's the case, but we'll try to break it down for you quite simply here. So first and foremost, direct emissions, right? That's those are coming from your own assets. Those are things like combustion from heating, for example, so the burning of natural gas, but also more importantly, refrigerant emissions. So when they leak into the atmosphere, that is considered a direct emission. Indirect emissions, that's energy purchase. So think about energy i.e. electricity coming from the power grid. There's plenty of solutions associated with that, which we won't go into a whole lot of detail on, but you can see the examples down below. And then the catch-all of scope 3 emissions, which is really your supply chain, right? Think about emissions up and down your supply chain and how that impacts your overall emissions portfolio. So think third party in that instance. But what we're really going to talk about today, again, is the solutions and particularly refrigerant management, as we're referring to as the ugly duckling of the carbon conversson.
Yeah,
wait, I take a little bit, ugly duckling. I think it could be quite beautiful.
Well,
that's right. It's in a transition. That's going to be beautiful.
Exactly. If you remember the old childhood story, the ugly duckling does indeed turn into a beautiful swan. So that's why we've coined the term ugly duckling, really to help illustrate why this conversation is so critically important. So we've used a number of different terms, including the Cinderella of the carbon conversation, given she hasn't yet been invited to the ball. And when we say she, we're talking about refrigerants
in general. Yeah,
exactly. But really, in this case, we'll jump off on the ugly duckling, or the greenhouse gas ugly duckling, if you may. And really, the easiest way to look at it is this is a 200 gigaton opportunity. And what we oftentimes say is imagine the single biggest climate solution of which it has been deemed is overlooked and growing fast. Well, it's happening.
It's here.
It's here. It's happening. And that's why we're talking about it. So we really need to think about refrigerants as the climate triple threat, or I would argue opportunity that they are. So, the definition of the ugly duckling is appearing unpromising and different from its siblings, but has great potential. And refrigerant management does indeed have great potential, especially when utilizing advanced solutions like leak detection, whether that be indirect or direct solutions, which we're going to dive into, talk a little bit more about. So,
I love how you frame that as emissions, because that is something that is not paid attention to enough, not just in our industry, but globally and outside of our industry. When we think about emissions, we're typically thinking about like CO2 or, carbon emissions, things from combustion engines, things from, factories, not realizing that any refrigerant released into the atmosphere is the same type of emission folded over sometimes thousands fold, right? That whole GWP is our emissions relationship into comparison to CO2, right? Most industries are going, hey, we don't want to release a whole bunch of CO2. And they're going, okay, let's do what we can to not release CO2. And we're over here going, but we release tens of thousands times that sometimes.
Yeah.
And
oftentimes referred to as super pollutants for the right reason, right? Yeah, we're talking anywhere between, with the common refrigerants deployed today, as many of you are aware, talking between 2,000 and 4,000 and as high as 10,000 times more potent than CO2 as it relates to the global warming potential of said gases. So it's really critically important, and you're teeing me up for one of the oncoming slides here.
Sweet.
But yeah, and we'll try to visualize the magnitude of that a little bit further, which it quite honestly, it isn't easy to do when you're talking about invisible gases. Right?
True.
So, but why are these a triple threat, or as we would call them, an opportunity? Well, we oftentimes categorize them in three ways. They're mighty, overlooked, and growing. Why are they mighty? Well, as we talked about, it's a 200 gigaton opportunity. Solving refrigerant emissions globally has the opportunity to really curb the warming curve by about 0.5 degrees Celsius by the end of the century. Which, if you're keeping up with the climate science, that couldn't be more important. And it's really a short-term opportunity as well, largely because these are short-lived climate pollutants. So tackling these has, to your point, a greater impact than trying to go after some of the larger CO2 emissions that are a challenge in and of themselves.
Right.
Where was this really drawn to light, I guess, in recent years, was under a project called Project Drawdown, which was a collection of scientists, engineers, thought leaders globally that came together to really identify the top climate opportunities across the globe. And when they did the first ranking, which was in 2017, refrigerants came to the top. And the joke that came out of the Project Drawdown team at the time was, well, who's going to write that press release? Right?
Yeah.
Because most folks didn't have a clue that refrigerant emissions were going to rise to the top above just about any other or all climate solutions available. It is still ranked as the single biggest solution today. However, Project Drawdown has split the solutions into two categories: refrigerant management and alternative refrigerants. But if you add those two together, they still total up to number one. But I think it made it a little bit easier for them to communicate some of the other solutions as well.
Makes sense.
Yeah. And they have a great website too. Just if you want to go research and look at more, it's interesting to read through.
Yep, I couldn't agree more. It's a great resource to look into all the solutions that exist out there and how these that are near and dear to our hearts stack up against the rest of them.
They invested into some really, really good, high quality videos to help you understand the total planet impact that is happening right now. And they're very eye opening. So yeah, I encourage anyone to go check those out.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. So the other piece of it is they're overlooked. So refrigerants can be between 20 and 30% of scope 1 and 2 greenhouse gas emissions in corporate real estate. That's corporate real estate. That's not talking about the sector that we're focused on today, which is commercial refrigeration and things like supermarkets and cold storage, et cetera. So that order of magnitude grows significantly. But I think the most important thing, and the reason we're calling out corporate real estate here, is that most folks overlook refrigerants and don't believe that refrigerants have a material impact on their operations. We've often heard people call them, a niche sector that's only focused on supermarkets, for example. But the reality is that refrigerants are being utilized, as you all know, in just about every building globally to a certain extent, with the exception of some of the developed spaces that we're going to continue to adopt them, which comes into the growing piece here. So they are, in fact, the fastest growing greenhouse gas globally, and they're also accelerating. And why are they accelerating? Well, they're accelerating as we continue to electrify heating and the adoption of heat pumps, as this group has talked about quite a bit here recently, including with the introduction conversation that you had in the video there, and advanced heat pump technologies. And then, as I was just alluding to, on a warming planet, 1 billion people already lack access to cooling to stay safe today.
Wow.
And in many respects, you're going to see the introduction of cooling and hopefully sustainable and safe cooling into those spaces. But today it's certainly lacking in many respects. So the equity in terms of deploying that cooling safely into the rest of the globe is going to be critically important.
Jason Obju, who just popped in, he and I did a show, it's probably been a couple months now back, where we focused on the wet bulb global temperature, and people don't realize the growing intensity of the wet bulb scenario around the world. And many people don't realize we had our first incidence of 95-degree wet bulb in Texas last week, right? That's our first time in the United States that we've had multiple points that have actually succumbed the 95-degree wet bulb. And so worldwide, as we start getting closer to those points, we're going to have more and more people adding air conditioning systems, which is going to increase that demand on refrigerant. And so the escalation you're talking about, I think you can almost do an entire show on the escalation, because it's steamrolling faster than many people would realize.
I couldn't agree more. We all have our work cut out for us, and I think everyone on the show and tenfold are going to have to continue to evolve in terms of where the climate's going, how we manage refrigerants, and just how we deploy cooling and heating systems into the market, of course. So critically important conversation. Yeah, absolutely. Like to your point, it could be a whole show, if not series of shows in and of itself.
I agree.
So, yeah, going back to the order of magnitude here and what you were mentioning, right? We alluded to it in terms of the global warming potential associated with the refrigerants that are most common today, and for that matter, those that we're transitioning to. So, I want to call out that this is using the International Panel on Climate Change's Assessment Report 6 values. So those are 100-year values. So for those that are familiar with
Oh, I think we lost Tristam. Hold on a minute. Oh, now he's back.
All right. Sorry about that. Not sure.
No, that's all right.
I don't know how I got booted there for a second. Someone didn't like what I had to say about 20 years versus 100 years. So
yeah, no, it's a great topic because people don't understand the difference in those, and that's something that we talk about a lot. I'm glad you're bringing that up.
Fantastic. Well, yeah. So again, this is using 100-year values out of the Assessment Report 6, which one would argue is the latest and greatest science. However, the 20-year value really is probably the better yardstick, if you may, for measurement of refrigerant gases, largely because their lifetime or life cycle, I should say, really doesn't extend out to 100 years. It's
Right.
like I said, short-lived climate pollutants. So when you're thinking about measuring these, a 20-year value is really probably the more scientific approach. However, that's not how things are oftentimes done from a policy perspective. But not to dive too deep into the policy and regulation side of things, but you will see states like New York, for example, leaning into the 20-year value versus the 100-year value, while you'll see the feds and the EPA, for example, in California and other states still utilizing the 100-year value. So worth calling out that this is a 100-year value. 410A, you can see the order of magnitude there on the screen, approximately 2,200 GWP, whereas R32, which is now starting to obviously replace the more common HFCs that are out there today, like 410A, still has a global warming potential of 771. Some people are probably saying, well, wait a second, I thought it was below 700. Remember, this is using AR6 versus AR4. So really critically important to note that. And then again, order of magnitude, which is the benchmark or the baseline for GWP to begin with, which is CO2, which is also a common refrigerant. In fact, it was one of the original refrigerants, otherwise referred to as a quote unquote natural refrigerant, has a GWP of 1. Now, it's not to say that CO2 can be used universally. We know that it's tends to be application specific, and it doesn't come without its challenges. But again, this is just trying to frame the conversation around the impact of these refrigerants.
You bet.
So what does this mean? And not to go too deep into the science here, but it's critically important to understand the growth that we were just talking about and why these refrigerants are having such a tremendous impact. If you look back to 2004 up to 2024, you can see that the two major components of 410A, again, that most common refrigerant, which is a 50-50 blend of R32 and R125, have grown significantly. And again, this is atmospheric measurements. So this isn't taking data of leakage. This is actually measuring these two gases in the atmosphere. And this is NASA data here. You could see that those two gases have increased significantly in these atmospheric measurements. So this is not this is not something that we're imagining. This is something that is actually happening.
Well, we can validate it. When we look at reclamation of refrigerants, I actually just got off a meeting with Kate Horton from Hudson Technologies just a couple hours ago. We spend a lot of time talking about the importance of fixing leaks and reclamation because of this. When we look at an entire industry and we are bringing back 4% of the refrigerant that's being manufactured, the other 96% is not sitting in jugs in people's warehouses, right? It's because of leaks that have not been monitored and not been repaired for decades that we don't have the refrigerant because it's in the atmosphere, right?
Yep.
We have allowed this to happen, and that is the reason we have this rush, this super important movement within our industries to understand this, because it's always been here, but now we're actually feeling the effects of it. So those of you that are in the audience and those that are watching later, I hope you understand that the reason that we ring this bell is because we haven't for decades, and now we have to.
Yeah, so the easiest way of putting it too is, think about refrigerants as an asset.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And they truthfully are. And I think to your point around reclaim, the reclaim market of a very valuable asset, right? For the reasons that we all know, right? Not just because the cost fluctuations and the volatility of pricing around refrigerants, but for the mere fact that it provides what it provides in terms of heating and cooling, heating in the case of heat pumps and a source of cooling, and all other cases. We should be treating it as such, right? Mm-hmm. We shouldn't allow for it to leak into the atmosphere if for no other reason other than it is an asset. And we should treat it that way. But to put that into context, and I'm sure Hudson and others have said this in the past in conversations, but the reclaim rate here in the United States is between 1% and 3%.
Mm-hmm.
Right? It's certainly not much better globally. I think the numbers that I've heard in terms of the best possible reclaim is I believe Japan, and it's still less than 50% if I'm not mistaken. So if we're talking about a valuable asset here, we really need to think about how we can more effectively manage it, which is exactly what I'm beginning to outline here. So there's a framework we've developed to help folks understand the critical importance of how you begin to manage refrigerants. And again, It's not to say that everyone's going to dive in and, you know, be able to achieve all of this all at once, but, you know, these are the important elements that are critical to begin thinking about. So if the objectives are on the left, and you could easily swap out or include GHG reduction with cost reduction, and then compliance, really the two main areas of opportunity here are reduce and replace. And again, as Project Drawdown has outlined, and that's refrigerant management and alternative refrigerants. And under the reduction side of things, it's really, you know, the starting point is taking a critical assessment and conducting that assessment, developing an inventory within your portfolio, whether it's one building or 12 buildings, whether it's, you know, 10 assets or 10 pieces of equipment within that building, or even one for that matter, because again, refrigerants are an asset in of themselves. And then starting to identify tracking solutions. The old cliche is, if you can't manage what you don't measure, is critically important. And then really starting to actively manage them, implementing best practices and minimizing refrigerant leaks, thus emissions, is critically important. And one very valuable way of reducing and keying into refrigerant management is what David's going to talk more about. And that's, of course, identifying the right fit for purpose solution, and then deploying leak detection technologies, which go a very long way in terms of reducing your overall emissions and leakage from any asset, not just commercial refrigeration, but I would argue any refrigerant asset that exists out there.
Absolutely.
And then replace is really, you know, I would say a thoughtful process that you need to consider. The first and foremost is you want to reduce, right, before you start to replace. And there's always going to be requirements for replacement, whether that's at end of life, whether that's as a result of you know, critical failures, whatever the case may be. So start to think about how you can begin to deploy alternative refrigerants. And even in that case, you know, especially with A2L and A3 refrigerants coming to market, utilizing leak detection with those, not only for the purposes of reducing emissions, but also for the purposes of safety, is another critical component. So really, you know, you're checking a lot of boxes when you start to think about leak detection and effectively managing refrigerants, including when you're looking at alternatives. So, you know, identifying the least harmful options. You know, there's never going to be a perfect solution, but identifying the best possible solution, looking at technology gaps, leaning into R&D and innovation, thinking about technology pilots. And we would always argue that doing a technology pilot yesterday is far better than doing it tomorrow, so that you get used to what you're going to be leaning into in the future. Identifying assets and prioritizing how you're going to address those over a 10 to 15, even 20-year period is really critically important, because the pinch on refrigerant availability is going to be critical in the coming years. And when I say the coming years, I'm not talking about a decade from now. I'm
just a
few, 3 to 4 years from now, if not a year or two from now. For that matter.
That 2029, that next 30% reduction that we hit is going to be very significant, especially with the amount of R410A gas that is currently being used in systems inappropriately in some applications, and residential in particularly with the 454B shortage. We have to be very cautious. And as educators, we have to make sure that our audience, our students, are aware of all of this, because this is the world that they are entering right now. And we've seen even transitions, you know, getting down to, you know, 15-pound systems that we're now monitoring where we hadn't before. Many people aren't even aware of that. And another thing I wanted to make sure to clarify for anyone that is not familiar with what the GHG is of this, I'm assuming that we're going to be for greenhouse gas.
Correct. Yes.
Okay. Just wanted to clarify that for the audience. So a lot to educate on here.
Yes, indeed. Anytime you see GHG, that's greenhouse gas emissions, of course, which again, F gases are the fastest growing globally. So, and really the outcomes of this framework is developing a refrigerant emissions roadmap. And again, that is largely for the purposes of understanding how you're going to manage your refrigerants over the longer period, and how you're going to ensure that you have refrigerant gases for service applications. And I think it's critically important to call out that, you know, with the phase down, you know, the other regulatory frameworks that have been put into place, including refrigerant management under subsection H of the AIM Act, and then also, of course, the technology transition rules under subsection I, are really the demand mechanisms to support the supply phase down, right? So neither are perfect by any means, and I'm not advocating that they are, but it's really critically important whether those regulatory frameworks continue as they are framed today or whether they change. Regardless of that, if the supply is decreasing, everyone needs to be thinking about how they're managing the demand, whether it's compliance driven or otherwise. So, and also the streamlined reporting piece, again, going back to that old cliche, you can't manage what you don't measure, and managing assets is managing money.
Mm-hmm.
So, but I want to hand it over to David. He's going to talk about why leak detection technologies are so critically important, and continue to dive into that piece that I was just mentioning in terms of the value associated with deploying said technology. So, David, over to you.
Thank you so much, Tristam. And actually, go back one slide. I have an example, because I was thinking about this. We're working with a customer, client, that they took their assets. It was 1,000 installations, and they understood how much leaks there were, what kind of refrigerants they were using, the age of their assets. And then they measured leaks, and then they said, how much can we replace with CO2? How much do we have to do leak management? How much do we have to do investment into additional PM, preventative maintenance? And so it and the outcome, and kind of going left to right, the outcome was to get to lower emissions and a lower cost base. There's a good benefit. But I'm just, as you went through that, I was thinking of this client. It hit on each part of
one of those steps.
Each one of those steps, yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
perfect.
It's a lot of what we're working through with folks out in the field, right? That have large and small portfolios, is to get them to understand how they get from their objectives to their outcomes, and road mapping that with them, because again, it is going to be critically important, not only to think short term but long term. So that's a great anecdote, David.
Yeah. Well, I think about many of our instructors that are watching today. Some of these instructors are in very large campuses, with hundreds and potentially thousands of assets. And so when we start looking at our role in this, it becomes very relevant as where our position is as educators and as technicians and contractors, because we are all quickly becoming a integral part of this process.
Yeah. And the last thing folks want to be doing, especially when it comes to emergency repairs, right, is having to juggle the prioritization in real time. Right? It's a lot easier if you can think about prioritizing over the long term, and it's not always going to be perfect, but if you can be addressing assets, in a step phase approach versus, like I said, in a reactive approach, especially when it comes to servicing, having the availability to service said pieces of equipment as a result of the lack of refrigerants, that's just, in my mind, it's a no-brainer.
Yeah. Well, prime example, if for our audience, if you don't understand what we're talking about, if you don't think that this is currently happening, call any refrigeration contractor in the state of New York and ask them how it's going to, how things are going for working on R404 freezers right now.
Yeah.
Right. And you'll see that this is affecting us now. Like, this is not something we're preparing for in the future. It's already here. And the better we understand it, the better we can be prepared. Exactly like you're saying.
And actually, with that publishing that regulation earlier this year, that's what stimulated Tristam and I's conversation, because we both got an influx of inquiries on leak detection, what's the best technology, what's out there. Yeah. And then we talked about what we were hearing from the calls that came. I want to just talk about first, like, impact, and then the technology. Kind of what is the outcomes of these regulatory changes for a business. And first is on the risk side. You have investors that look at how companies are adjusting to regulations. You're looking at operational risk of not having an operation because you have leaks and you have to shut down. You have consumer sentiment. Consumers want businesses that are sustainable, green, that are doing the right thing, and the employees. So there's a lot of risk of losing employees and consumers if you're not doing the right thing, and just long-term sustainability because of cost. So kind of on the right-hand side is the cost of refrigerant and the cost of doing business if you have leaks. So one of the generally accepted numbers out there is that supermarkets are leaking at about 25%. So Tristam talked about having a valuable asset. Imagine you have this very valuable asset that you're just losing 25% every year because of leaks, and the cost of losing that is doubling. So on this chart, you can see where costs were. This is an average cost from the U.S. Bureau of Labor Sciences that
5 years.
Every year it's increasing and it's doubling to 2010. Part of that is regulation, which is creating scarcity of supply, as Tristam said, which is causing costs to go up. And this happened in Europe, it's happening here in the US, and it's going to continue to happen into the future. So that's some of the impact. On the next slide, what does that regulatory risk look like? And here's a couple of examples. You can see grocer A, B, and C having fines of $1 million, $1.5 million, and over $5 million for failure to implement leak detection and having leaks from their systems. And this shows some of the regulations, federal AIM Act, the New York that was just came out, the California CARB Act, and now there's more action in Washington State to do regulatory acts. So you've got layers of regulation going on that makes it challenging, but if not met, you have real hard dollar fines for not meeting those regulations.
Are these actual fines administered like from the EPA or from a federal level to facilities?
Correct.
Okay, this is a big topic then. So one of the one of the largest misperceptions in residential and light commercial technicians is that we have all this regulation, but nobody ever gets fined, right? We see that on social media all the time. That is not true. We've showed quite a few instances where people have been arrested. You would hope that it would be a significant amount that we can show, right? Here's this percentage of violations that are fined. But when you start looking at this on the larger scale, then you start recognizing that, of course, they're going after some of the larger players when the opportunities are there. And so these are actual fines rendered from the EPA on facilities for not following regulations.
Yes, and the fines can be $30,000 to $60,000 per day per leak if they're not dealt with in a correct way. So,
Boom.
so it's very expensive, and you can Google AIM Act. There's fines, but there's also big legal issues too if you don't take care of these things at a technician level. They have responsibility to do it, to do the reporting. So those are the fines. And then the next slide shows some of the additional costs. So if you look at the curve, there are some supermarkets that manage leak by reducing the amount of refrigerant in their system. So instead of running at an optimal level, they reduce the amount of refrigerant in the system so that when there is a leak, they don't lose as much refrigerant, and that way they're within regulatory bounds.
Range.
However, there is a cost to that, and that's in energy. And here you can see this curve. If you're running 60% of optimal, you're consuming 50% more energy to run your system.
Yeah.
And some are running towards the bottom of that, running at 90% inefficiency to 80% because they're running at 5 to 10%. And I've seen this in the field. And I've talked to different companies that this is their standard for managing refrigerant. This and is to run it at a low level. And this is hundreds of facilities.
Wow.
Because managing it, finding the leaks, knowing when they're going to occur is a lot of work, and it's hard to do. And unless you have technology and best practices deployed.
Man, that's significant. I didn't realize that. I mean, that's quite a bold statement, because especially when you start looking at, the energy usage in comparison to that. So I spent about, 3/4 of my career in the field in commercial refrigeration and building automations. And so my last 5 years as a mobile engineer was with a grocery chain. And on our older stores, we actually had monitoring algorithms that we set up in our rack rooms so that we were monitoring energy consumption, and we were doing comparative graphing of energy consumption, because some of the older racks didn't have as good of internal management. They were old Temprite Tyler systems. And so we could monitor temperatures, which were okay. But if we could monitor energy usage, we actually had a better opportunity to start looking for leaks early. And it is significant how much energy a system will start using when it is short on refrigerant. It's very drastic.
A really important point. Is one of the things that we've been chatting about quite a bit here recently with a number of different parties, including utility programs, is as other utility incentives start to dry up for things like LED lighting, for example, there's a significant opportunity to lean into, for example, leak detection, right?
Yeah.
The correlation you both were just outlining in regards to when refrigerant systems leak, not only are they having a direct impact, but they're also having an indirect impact on the energy usage. So not only is it thinking about it from a total system benefit, as folks like California would refer to it, but you can actually, again, draw the correlation between refrigerant leakage and increased energy usage. So there have been some states, Vermont as kind of being a leader in this regard, where their utility programs have adopted incentives for leak detection systems. One of the tracks that we're on is trying to dive into further measurement and verification to encourage other utility programs to adopt leak detection as another important methodology for reducing not only direct emissions, but indirect emissions via energy usage. So it's critically important.
Yeah, we actually negotiated a grant with a utility provider. It was in Indiana. It's probably 8-9 years ago when I was with that grocery store. So we had bargained for a grant to do two projects, LED light modifications, but installation of refrigerant detection in the older existing grocery stores. And it was covered under part of that grant by the local utility because they seen the value in adding a system that was monitoring refrigerant because of the correlation to energy consumption.
Yeah. And energy consumption is really more apparent or on mind, or we're used to managing that. And so it does get funding. And so this correlation is so important. A little bit more about Matelex, and then we'll go into some of the technology solution. Is we're in 4,000 plus installations. The accepted average is 25% on leak rates. We're between 4, 5, and 8% is our range of leaks. That's with a system installed and well managed. We have all these different refrigerants under management. So we manage CO2 along with 404A. It's a broad spectrum solution. Go to the next slide. I can. This is to Tristam's point. You can't manage what you don't measure, and so our system is an automatic leak detection system. And just like kind of a point on leak detection, you have manual leak detection, which is the handheld where you go and you check for, point leaks and you pinpoint leaks. You have direct detection, which is typically very good for safety in an enclosed area. And then you have automatic leak detection, which is kind of the system we're going over here. That's for very complex systems where it's looking at the integrity of the whole system and determining a leak within an entire system. So it's not a point solution, but it's checking the system. Measurement is the first part of that. It is understanding that system. We look at measuring the volume in the system. That's the method. And as if the volume is constant, there's no leak. And so we have an analysis which looks at the parameters, because it's a gas, natural gas law. It changes with temperature, pressure, usage. And so we measure all these points, and there's different methods for automatic leak detection. This is the method that we're using. We specifically measure it. We measure the volume, and then when the volume doesn't meet the parameters, and there's less in the system than what the temperature, pressure, and usage would indicate, then we know there's a leak. And then it's optimized through a proactive approach. So these are kind of the three-step approach that we've developed and utilize.
That's a big difference from what we've had traditionally. If we think about some of these existing, leak detection systems, they were just using refrigerant leak detectors, right? At strategic places throughout the facility. One of the things that I always was concerned with was that style of detection is, what if we have a leak in a condensing unit, right? Whereas yours, you're actually calculating volumetric capacity of the system, where, if we had a refrigerant leak detector on a roof, it's probably not going to detect anything unless you have a very significant release of refrigerant. So it's adding in that calculation of data that I think is really cool.
Yeah, I mean, right now, and it's interesting when we do the installs, you can see it with the installers and end users. It's like you go from having a black box where you do not know what's going on in that system, and a leak can happen anytime, and you can have an emergency to going out there, to being able to see very detailed what's going on in the system and get an alert before there's a temperature event, before there's a major issue. This I'll share. This study, it's there's some detail to it. I'll just go over kind of the first line. This study was 4 stores, 404A. It was a 6-month study where we put in our technology, the Matelex technology, and then we let the current maintenance program run as is without visibility. Then when we would see a leak occur, and between that, then sometime in the future, temperature or routine maintenance, they would discover a leak. And the difference between when we discovered it and they discovered it is represented here. As you can see, on store number 1 there we found a leak. Actually, this was day 1. It took 6 days for the maintenance group to find it. So there was number of days saved is 5. And it's really dependent on the size of leak. So smaller leaks are harder to find. And if you look at, and we also do an estimate of how big the leak is. That one was, if you look, 41.7 kilos a day. That was a large leak. So we found it relatively quickly, as they did. If you look at store 2, rack 2, that took us 28 days to find, but alternatively, it took the maintenance program 131 days. So we would find that leak 103 days before, meaning we would, if you go and you fix at that time, you save the amount of refrigerant that's leaked during that time.
Absolutely.
And on average, at the bottom, you can see we would find the leak 60 days before the maintenance program would, and that's about 80%, 79%, almost 80% of the refrigerant loss if it was fixed on the day that the alert happened. So that's one study. This was done by a third party. We just provided the technology and the know-how how to use it.
Yeah, I'm sure they all purchased and installed more after that.
Yeah, we went from, in just a few years, gone from 7,000, 2,000, 3,000, 4,000. We really are ramping up, and if we look at kind of what does early leak detection, which is what automatic leak detection, that's what the regulatory wants to be installed, and it's what it mandates with certain size installations, 1,500 for New York State and 1,500 for federally. They have a little bit different nuances on timing, but it's regulated. Why do they want to do it? One, you save refrigerants, the global warming, but it actually makes sense. So you save on refrigerants first. You save on energy costs, as we saw the correlation there in what Vermont is also supporting. Cost of compliance. So if you're doing this and you correctly, you have automatic leak detection. We have a reporting module that shows how much is leaked, shows when something has been fixed, or if it's not fixed, again, it'll have another alert so that it gets fixed. That's another common problem is someone will come in, they'll say, oh, there's a leak. Oh, we fixed it. And you don't know if it's actually fixed unless
you
you're
found a
measuring
leak.
it. Yeah.
Right.
So, and then it can be a chronic leaking, which is another whole regulatory issue. So that visibility saves money. It helps coordinate between the maintenance, the facility management, and the end user or a customer.
Well, I think about just the manual labor savings alone. We are facing technician shortages, by the tens of thousands annually throughout all of our industry. And I know, like for my stores, every store had a monthly manual refrigerant leak check. We would walk the entire store, every case. You would spend 5 or 6 hours per store, every single store times a few hundred stores. That amount of labor adds up very quickly versus a system that is monitoring and measuring it for you continuously.
Yeah, that's a great point, and that's part of what's looked at for return on investment.
Yeah.
And reasons to make an investment is on automatic leak detection. You have to go in and calibrate one time per year. That's the requirement on that, and you can rely on it because it has full visibility if there's a leak or not, and that's a huge benefit. It allows a lot of people to sleep better at night, and it's one of the main reasons to make a change.
Absolutely, I definitely see that. Very cool. All right, a lot of great content. Everyone in the audience, if you have any questions, now's a great time to give us your thoughts, right? If you haven't thought about the state of, leak detection and leak monitoring and our responsibility in that before, now's a great time. And so we've got two of the top experts from the industry here to answer any questions that you have. And yeah, let's talk about resources for connecting with both of you afterwards. Tristam, you're already up here.
Yeah, I mean, feel free to reach out anytime. We work with a variety of end users, solutions providers, policymakers. We can kind of run the gamut. So if we can ever be a resource, whether it's just a quick question or interested in collaboration, we're happy to help. We set out really to move the needle in the industry and help folks, save dollars, reduce their impact, and most importantly, stay in compliance. So we're here if you need us.
Yeah, and happy to reach out to us. Reach out to Ming Yang. She is very collaborative, knows the business, and can help answer questions. We work with a lot of installers. We work with a lot of end users. We understand regulations. We can also provide some early assessment on looking at your systems and what could be a good strategy to start to get to some savings and whatnot. So feel free to reach out to Ming and her emails there, and also through LinkedIn too as well.
All right, fantastic. Well, gentlemen, I sure appreciate your time today. That's a lot of content. It's a much deeper dive than we'd done before on where the state of the industry was a year ago. And I'm so grateful that you're giving us, an update, because there's so many changes. We have transitions that are going to continue to happen. We have legislation that is constantly in debate. But one thing is for sure, we are going to be going through an HFC phase down, and we will be introducing new lower GWP refrigerants into the mix. But for the legacy systems and the existing systems that are, currently with higher GWP refrigerants, many applications, it's not feasible for especially our larger grocery store chains, to do complete system conversions for every store. So we have a lot of HFC systems that are going to be in play for decades. And if we want to be able to service these systems, we have to get better at monitoring and managing our refrigerant leaks. It's just an absolute have to.
I would add just one thing. You could, if anyone's interested, Matelex, if you go to our website, has a lot of good information, and we have a impact calculator there that can estimate what your impact is for global warming for your installations, and also the dollar impact that's having, which can allow you to have a good, just a good first view of how refrigerants are impacting your business, and then also again feel free to reach out to us.
And I threw that on the ticker. I'm also going to put it in the chat for anybody, so you have direct access to that. And I'm also going to go grab Tristam's as well.
Yeah, our website is not quite as informative, but as I said, we're as a small and growing business. Please feel free to reach out anytime. I will always respond very, very quickly. So I'm always looking forward to having conversations on this topic and plenty of others.
All right, and I'll throw that in the chat as well. That'll be in the messages. Anyone wants to check out any of those. All right, well, guys, I sure appreciate your time. I look forward to our future conversations, and we thank all of you for hanging in with us, and we hope that you understand that the solution is you. Thank you. Everybody have a great day, and we'll see you all next week on Did You Know? The ESCO HVAC Show. Bye, guys.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.